serious, Redditors who have lived in a haunted house, what are your most unexplainable paranormal experiences? Closest I've got to a haunted house is a haunted room. I used to sleep on the second floor, the bottom one being the first, and my sister in the attic. She used to have sleep paralysis often. Then she moved out and now I have her old room. She no longer has sleep paralysis. But I do. I lived in a house for about 5 years that was haunted. But not in a malicious way. In a shitty roommate kind of way. I'd come home to the windows on the second floor being open when it was raining. To food containers being open and the fridge that I hadn't touched yet. And X200B. The worst was that the ghost hated clocks. She hated them. I had antique cuckoo clocks that had worked for 50 years that would just stop. Brand new wall clocks that ate through batteries like it was candy. My watch ended up on the floor one morning. The crystal shattered. Even though I knew I slept with it on. The one that pissed me off the most was that I got a brand new Kit Kat clock for Christmas, and the BTCH threw it off the wall. I was cooking and out of corner of my eye saw the cat freaking fly. Turned around and it was across the kitchen. Broken. It was brand new. And X200B. Man. She was a bitch. I watched one of our cats being pulled backwards about 5 feet by her tail. She was walking through the dining area and suddenly was sliding backwards. As if someone was pulling her by her tail. Only there wasn't. She freaked out and tried to run. But couldn't immediately as something held on for a brief second before letting her go. I tend to think that was the handiwork of a 4 or 5 year old girl ghost who hangs out and she just wanted to play with the kitty. I used to live in an old big 5-bedroom house with 6 other people. My so and I shared one of the rooms. I saw a stranger in my room when I was in my 20s. It wasn't exactly visible. But I somewhat knew it was right there in the corner of the room. My so was next to me sleeping. While I had my eyes open. I knew it was there. So I closed my eyes. I tried to wish it away. I opened my eyes. And it was now next to the bed. Looking at me. I closed my eyes again. And suddenly relief came. I opened my eyes. Nothing there. I saw it once again at the stairs. It was only a brief moment this time. And then it was gone. I had fallen asleep at night with my fan running. And woke up freezing. I turned it off. Not long after. I woke up hot. And turned it back on. This happened several times. The last time. I woke up hot once again. And the moment I opened my eyes. I heard the pull of my fan and looked up to see it slowly start speeding up. I said, "Thank you." And fell back asleep. I live in a house built in the 1800s. It survived the 2 world wars and it's seen some shit I imagine. One of the previous owners had 2 sons. Who both committed suicide. A lot of strange stuff happens. The animals, dog and parrots, will wake up from their naps and follow something with their heads just as they would follow me if I walk around. Also, before I switched rooms in the house. My brother had a room and he refused to sleep there as he would hear voices. He slept with my parents, he was a child, until the day he got my old room and since then has slept in that room without problems. There's also a whole floor we don't use and I sleep in the attic. And I pass through that floor to get to my attic. Weird explanation but it's a weird house. And I have a motion activated light there that goes on as I'm walking the stairs to that unused floor. It would also switch on in the middle of the night while nobody is walking under the motion detector. Also, there's cold spots. I lived in one when I was a teen. Along with my parents. Several instances come to mind. We were remodeling an old farmhouse and had been there a couple of months before witnessing anything. One day I was underneath my truck. Which was supported by only a jack. Stupid. I know, I was in the middle of working on it. With no good reason to get out at that moment. Suddenly the overwhelming urge to get out from underneath overwhelmed me. No sooner than I got out. The truck fell to the ground. The jack had slipped. Freaked Dad out. He thought I was under it. When Mom got home, we mentioned it. And she started crying. Sobbing pretty hard. It turns out the previous owner died in the driveway. Under a vehicle. In that spot. I would often see moving shadows. And strangely hear music from the upstairs area. The windows of the old house were corked shut. And blackbirds would often get caught between the panes. We ended up replacing all the windows, but we had to break 3 inside panes to get them out. One of the more disturbing things happened when my mother was cooking breakfast. She turned away to get something out of the cabinet, and when she turned back around, all the forks set out were bent straight up. My father-in-law died before my son was born, so he never met him. When we moved into our new home, my son would often be laughing in the middle of the night by himself. No biggie. Kids will play with anything. One day, we were finally putting pictures up in the house, and once I put up the picture of my father-in-law, he said, "Oh mommy, why do you have a picture of the man that comes and play with me at night?" He had never ever seen a picture of my father-in-law before. One night when I was about 12, I was drifting off to sleep. Then I clearly heard a baby laugh for 1-2 seconds. Presumed it was just my imagination and went to sleep. The next morning my sister mentioned that she'd been woken up by the sound of a baby crying. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I've never been able to explain that. A little backstory. Growing up, my brother and I lived with our single mother. The house was a little 500 square foot home. But we were young, so it wasn't a huge deal. My mom remarried, and the newlyweds decided to tear down the old house and build a ranch on the land. Strange, but explainable. Things started happening after we moved back in. One of the strangest things to happen was when my brother and I were in the house alone. We were hanging out at an island in the kitchen, talking about what teenage boys talk about, when I hear the faintest whisper of someone saying my brother's name. Probably just hearing things. About 30 seconds later, a little louder, my brother's name again. He was talking when I heard the second whisper, and he seemed to hear it too because he stopped what he was saying briefly. Finally, about 15 seconds after the second interruption, clearly and angrily, a raspy voice says his name. We looked at each other and he asked, "Did someone just say my name?" I told him I'd heard it more than once. He said 3 times. Right? We grabbed our coats and went to get Burger King. We lived in a haunted pub on the site of a former Catholic abbey that Henry VI had destroyed. We saw some weird shit. The weirdest was the insectocutor in the kitchen. Something peeled it apart in the night. No sign of a break-in. All the doors were locked and the alarms set. It wasn't smashed. Not an explosion. The metal was peeled outwards. A couple months later we had an incident in the cellar. The entire pump system blew out, ruining you a cute 1k of beer. Engineers could not find the cause of the fault and just replaced the system. There were other incidents. People captured on CCTV that weren't there. The underfloor cellar doors slamming. The pub Furby talking in the middle of the night. And many more things that would be slightly odd out of context. Moved from the US to the UK and our parents bought an old beat up house. It still had lead pipes for the water. Nightmare all on its own. Anyway, work proceeded on the house whilst we lived there. We started seeing bright lights in the corners of rooms at night. Footsteps on floorboards. The house had carpet. I was about 6 at the time and started getting woken up in the night by a little girl who would dance on my chest of drawers for me. I was frickin' terrified. My mum just fobbed it off as me dreaming. Workmen complained of strange things happening, like tools being moved and odd feeling like being watched. After about a year of this, my eldest sister's friend stayed overnight. She woke the whole house up screaming, saying a little girl had been in her room. She had apparently pulled her from the bed. The friend left the house and refused to ever come back. Mum decided she might need to do something about it and got some advice. He suggested my mum and the whole family should treat the presences as part of the family. So when we got home we shout, "Hi, we're home. Did you have a good day?" Over time the house settled and we didn't get any more trouble. We also found out a little girl did die in the house of asthma. My parents still live there and it is a beautiful homely place now. I used to be a server for an old church school that was definitely haunted. I'd be there early to get ready. No one else around. And I'd hear a scream sometimes. Most of the time. The metronome on the piano would turn on by itself. It didn't really bother me though. Because I grew up around the ghost of my older brother. Who died before I was born. Lights and toothbrushes would turn off on their own. Pictures would move or DVDs would fall for no reason. One time we placed a candy on a baby photo of him and asked him to move it. It moved. Thanks. Older bro. Close bracket. I'm sure this will get lost. But I have to share. I am not the type to believe in ghosts. But this happened to me and I have no explanation. My mom passed away in 2016 at 56 of cancer. She was in hospice and died in her home. One of her favorite songs was Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which I added to her memorial video. Fast forward months later. I am cleaning out her home of her belongings by myself. There is no one else there. At one point I have an emotional breakdown and step outside to collect myself. When I return, I hear music coming from the other side of the house. Which immediately struck me as weird. As not only was I there alone, but the electricity in the home is shut off. I follow the music to a bookshelf, where I find it emanating from a snow globe. It's motion activated and only plays music when picked up. The song? Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Lived in a house from 1938. I would wake up and sit up in bed every single night at 2:59-3. 1 AM. I thought I saw something move quickly out of the corner of my eye on occasion but assumed it was me being sleepy, bad vision without my glasses. One night the curtain on my closet moved. I pulled the lamp chain and the room lit up. My husband thought I was crazy. I saw nothing so I pulled the chain again to turn off the lamp. I tried to sleep again but a few minutes later I heard the lamp chain swinging against the lamp base. When I reached out to see if I felt it swinging and to stop it, something cold touched me. It didn't feel like the shape of a hand or finger but like a wet washcloth. We moved soon after that due to relocating, but I stopped waking up every morning at the new house and haven't had any weird feelings since. Lived in a basement apartment with a roommate in college back in 2010. We were eating dinner in the living room watching a movie one night and his bedroom is like 3 feet away from the couch we're sitting on and closed over but not latched. So we're eating dinner and watching this movie and then his door starts opening and creaking, so we pause the movie and watch as the door swings slowly open all the way. It stopped there and we looked at each other and claimed a breeze or a loose hinge. Then the door started closing again, only this time about halfway through the movement. The handle turned so that it was perpendicular to the ground. The door closed all the way and the handle released slowly, latching the door closed. The handle in question was sort of like the ones velociraptors can open in Jurassic Park. So preface this story saying I'm a huge skeptic of any kind of stuff like this. But I've never found a way to explain this. My sister and then 4-year-old niece moved into a townhouse apartment complex. Niece is 14 now and still remembers this vividly. Ran into my sister's room not long after screaming about the man in her room yelling at her. My sister jumps out of bed and searches around for anyone or anything out of place. Finds nothing. Doors and windows still locked. Happens a couple more times over the next few nights. Niece doesn't want to sleep there. Won't go into her room, etc. So my sister is chatting with one of the other moms at the complex playground one day and the other lady mentions how creepy that is considering the guy that overdosed in that apartment a few years back. Apparently his son's room was now my niece's room. So my mom does some digging and found the guy's name, which led to his obituary. Pulled up the picture from the obituary and called my niece into the computer room. She got half a step into the room when she saw the photo on the monitor and ran out screaming about the man. Have absolutely no explanation as to how she recognized this guy's picture. My son, about 4 years old at the time, would jabber away in his room by himself. One day, my wife asked him who he was talking to. He said he was talking with Alice and that she used to feed the men who lived here. He went on to say that she died because she couldn't breathe. Our house used to be a boarding house before World War II. When I was a kid about 8 or 9 years old, I had a TV stand in front of my window. The lights from the street always were on, so in the dark I could easily make out the outline of where my TV was. I started seeing a shadow figure of a girl standing right next to my TV. I could make out her figure so clear. Hair and everything. I spent nights just looking at her. I couldn't even sleep. One night I got sick of it and threw a pillow at her. As soon as I did, I put my head under the other pillow. I had a couple minutes and looked up, and she was right next to me at the edge of my bed. I screamed so loud and my parents came in and turned on the lights. A few days later my little sister told me that she has been seeing a little girl in her room. I never told my little sister about my experience prior to that. Weird. I have 2 good ones. 1. Green eyes. Lived in Turnquist and MD. Plane went down in the area killing 81. Lighting struck the fuel or something. Well, the house was out of code and electrical was always fritzy. I would go down to fix the power. And these eyes would show up. Green floating eyes. Green like Mountain Dew, and all of the eye is green, not just the iris. My dog would not go down there with me to fix the power. And when the power came back up, the eyes would be gone. The eyes never appeared the same place. 2. I was house sitting a home in Gorm. Old house, no nearby neighbors, all the power was out for a issue down the road. I heard kids laughing in the next room over. There were no kids. Nor anything to make that noise. I left. Nope, no thank you. Good day. We lived in an old slave plantation on St. Croix when I was a kid. Very few locals ever visited the place. So in a ho when we moved in, my sister, 4 at the time, asked my dad who the man with the big knife was. My dad was like, "Da fuck," but decided to check things out anyways and found nothing. Then we'd frequently smell fresh jasmine blooming, which, come on, people have that tea growing in their yards. So whatever we move in and the locals are like, "What? You moved into that place?" And my dad would be like, "Hell yeah. Why?" So they started to tell him about the slave who would serve the master's tea every day and about the ghost with a machete. We didn't move. Spent 3 years there. Dog ate an entire turkey, foil and all, and there was a tarantula infestation, but that's about it. Living in Chicago last year in a top floor apartment of a 3-flat style building. The kitchen at the back of the apartment had a door leading to a staircase down to the basement, connecting all the apartments and to outside. My housemate was cooking. She left the back door open as we had no AC or windows big enough for ventilation. As I walked into the kitchen, she ran to the back door and slammed it shut as I heard a woman's voice saying hello over and over coming from the stairs. We stood behind our door listening, and we could hear someone was coming up the stairs really slowly. The steps creaking all the way up to our back door. Then they reached the top, turned around and went back down again. After 5 minutes of being quite freaked out, another housemate and I slowly went down to the basement with some makeshift weapons and checked it out. Looked around and inside everything possible and calmly saying hello back. Nothing there. A lady did live in the basement apartment but would never have any reason to come upstairs to the top. And was nowhere to be seen either. The landlord then let us know his mother haunts the whole building. We lost our first home during the housing collapse. It was heartbreaking. Both my husband and I grew up in rentals. Home ownership was a big deal for us both, losing it because my biggest shame. It took several years to right the ship, and I am proud to say we bounced back better than ever. After a long search we found our dream. A beautiful affordable cabin in the woods. The previous owner of my house died in a motorcycle crash. The house had been on the market for years prior to our closing. I dreamed that the previous owner left me a fruit basket and a handwritten card which read, "Take care of it for me." When we moved in, I found vintage mason jars with fruit baskets etched in them. That first year it seemed whenever we needed something like a simple tool or screw to fix something in the house, it would just turn up in the shed or in a cabinet. He built the house with his own 2 hands. He converted it from an old hunting cabin into a 4-bedroom house. It was a labor of love for him. Here is the crazy thing. We decided to research his accident. He died 3 years before we moved in, on the exact day that we lost our first house. I used to see my late grandma around the house, but usually only the glimpse or the backside of her. Sometimes I heard they talked in Chinese in the middle of the night. When I was a kid, I remember feeling so terrified I almost vomited. I lived in an older home for about 5 or so years. My stepdad, who knew the man who had lived there before us, told me he hung himself in the attic. I honestly didn't think much of it. That is until I heard the footsteps. Like clockwork. Every night at 3 a.m. I would hear footsteps walking along the length of the attic, which would go over my room. The steps were heavy and you could clearly tell the pace was at a normal walking speed. It sounded like a man contemplating something, thinking about his next move. If it was really the former owner, were those his final moments being played out every night before his fateful decision? Who can say? There were other stories, but those footsteps, which went on for years, still freak me out. I've posted one story about the haunted loft apartment. Too many to tell, but I'll tell the one that FK'd with me most. I work night shift so I sleep during the day. BF and Mill went out for the day. I know for a fact no one was home. I woke up, lay there for a second, groaned and stretched, and a man's voice groaned back right beside my head. I noped out of there pretty fast. Checked the house. Home alone. Fun fact: the previous owner was an elderly man who died in the front room. He likes to shut and lock our doors when we're not paying attention. We used to live in a house that was built in 1956. There were several things that happened. When my middle daughter was in preschool and kindergarten, she would be trying to go to sleep and would be crying that someone touched her hair, touched her feet and even said her name in her ear. Finally, when all 3 of my girls were in school, I went into her bedroom and said, "Whoever is touching her and saying her name, please stop. I know you only want to get her attention, but you are scaring her." After that, it never happened again. Around the same time, we removed the carpet in our living room and hallway and put down a wood floor. My husband went to work nights and I would always hear a child running in the hallway. I would get up and check my 3 girls and they would be fast asleep. It happened so often that I stopped checking on the kids. Once my husband was off and even he heard it. He was sleeping. Woke up and said one of the girls was up. I said no they weren't and he said they are. I heard them running in the hallway. I had previously not even mentioned it to him because he is a huge skeptic and TBH, I didn't want to deal with his attitude about it. As a kid I would make stupid videos with my friends, and sometimes I like to rewatch them and cringe at our shenanigans. Quite recently I rewatched a video a friend and I made in 08/09. The video consists of our usual F-king about. Halfway through the video there is a short 2-second clip, wherein my friend is flailing a toy sword around and screaming in my room. My friend is sitting with his back to the open door. A dark figure is seen walking down the hallway past the open door. The figure is only visible a split second, but there is no doubt something passed by. The thing is, I remember vividly being home alone that day. My father always told me a guy burned to death in that hallway, and my mother swore she sometimes heard coughing at night. I remember the hallway always smelling faintly of smoke, even though no one in my family smoked. IDK kinda spooky. I lived in a basement of a duplex that I believe was haunted. I had a few experiences there involving seeing a shadow figure. One night my wife woke me up and said someone's in the house. Okay. My heart is pounding already. I get out of bed and look down the hallway and see a figure standing there at the end of the hallway in the kitchen. Then the figure turns and walks out of view. I walk a few steps into the hall to turn the light on and start yelling at this person I think is intruding into my place. I get into the kitchen and nobody is there. I didn't hear any noises or see any sign of anyone being in the apartment. They would have had to cross my field of view to leave the apartment. I got back in bed and asked my wife how she knew someone was in the house. She said she woke up and looked down the hallway and saw someone standing there. My wife had to work graveyard shifts for a month right after this and it was so hard to sleep by myself after that. I thought about it every single night I was trying to fall asleep. I lived in a house growing up that I was convinced was haunted. I would have reoccurring nightmares of finding my family murdered. My sister had reoccurring nightmares of my dad murdering our family. When I had nightmares I would walk downstairs to sleep with my mom, and every time there were human-shaped light beings walking up the stairs, I would press my back against the wall as I walked down. Most of the time the beings just continued up without noticing me. Sometimes they would look right at me though. As an adult I have rationalized it due to the incredible amount of stress going on and the very violent nature of my father at the time. Although once we moved my dad stopped being violent and both my and my sister's nightmares went away. My ex-wife was staying at her grandparents' house, which used to be a church. All the cousins have stories from this place, but my wife's was an odd one. They are all listening to the radio one night when the window drapes start moving a lot and nothing but static started coming from the radio. The girls freaked out and started screaming. As soon as they started screaming it stopped and a voice came out of the radio saying, "Sorry to have bothered you. I'll leave you alone now." Drapes went back in place. Music comes back on. My wife and I were laying in bed and I was facing the wall and she was holding me. I heard a very heavy breath that definitely didn't come from her because her mouth and nose were buried in the back of my neck. At the same time she went, "Was that you? Did you breathe in my ear?" She felt the breath that I very clearly heard. We've also had hangers come flying across our room. We had shower rings go missing, and then while playing D&D they came flying from our f***ing empty kitchen 3 months later. It's bizarre. Nothing actually harmful has happened and we don't want to provoke it, so we just leave things alone. It always gets worse after we change something about the house. Remodeling, changing the shower curtains etc. seem to make things happen. Small 2-bedroom apartment next to an old farmstead. I was about 14 at the time when I started to notice weird things happening, such as dishwasher randomly starting. It was old and had to be started manually when I was home alone. Laundry detergent would fall off the shelf and spill everywhere despite it being a foot back on the shelf and being closed. And another thing that stood out to me was random yelling. The yelling was very unsettling considering our neighbors were an old frail woman about 80 years of age and a yoinf male who was never home due to him being a nurse. The yelling sounded like a young woman and it was more of a scream of pain. After a while we ended up deciding to move. After we packed up and left, the landlord moved into our old apartment. A few weeks later he was found dead in that apartment. The only reason anyone found him was because the smell started to permeate into the other living areas. It's really weird because the landlord was super healthy, mid-20s working class type of guy. It was not a suicide. A woman died peacefully in my childhood bedroom. When I was young and learning to read, I'd stay up late sounding out words in Harry Potter. Once when I got stuck, I heard a soft female voice say the word correctly. I thanked her, assuming it was my mother, but looked up to see an elderly woman who disappeared a second later. A few years past this, I struck up a friendship with an elderly lady down the road who liked to bake and feed me cookies. She had been close friends with the woman that lived in our house. Her name was Rose, and showed me a photo of her. It was the woman who had sounded out the word for me. I never had a bad experience in that house, and I'm glad Rose was there to help me out. My grandparents' old house had a room where the previous owner's daughter committed suicide. During the summers where I would stay over, I would sleep in that room. It was always cooler and some nights very cold too. Keep in mind this is the summer in SoCal, some nights I would wake up freezing. I didn't find this out until I was about 16 when I overheard my mom talking about it as they were selling the house. Have posted this before. I used to write off anything spooky as tricks of the eye, ears and or mind. Then one night in my 20s while staying at an apartment my brother rented in Spain, I saw and heard a human-shaped shadowy apparition standing by the side of my bed. It was whispering my name while reaching out towards me and pulled on my pillow, dragging me towards it. I pulled away and hid under the covers until I fell asleep. It was such an extreme encounter I chalked it up as a vivid dream and never said anything about it. But 3 days later at the airport my sister-in-law told me she saw a ghost the night I stayed at their place. She said a dark shadowy figure came out of my room and then stood in the living room for a while before disappearing. So we both saw the same thing the same night. But she verified it before I had ever mentioned it. I can't help but think that was a real encounter. A couple years ago, my 5-year-old, then 3, was using a flashlight to look down the cat hole in the basement door. Cat needed to get down to the litter box. My son came running into the living room, face white and big eyes, saying a man was crawling up the basement steps. I asked him what he looked like and he said he had pink skin and big hair. To this day he still brings it up every now and then and not one detail has changed. I completely believe that he saw someone. That basement sometimes gives me the creeps too. I lived in a house my friend said was haunted when I was 9-14 years old. Nothing particularly weird happened except I saw large white figures from the downstairs mirrors. They looked like they were about 2 meters tall and were slightly humanoid. Their faces were full white and their hands were much shorter in proportion to their size than on a human. They also spoke in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like my native language but some words were completely different. I didn't go downstairs alone because of that for almost all the time I lived there. My parents told me that when I was a kid I used to play with a little imaginary girl in my room. Until one day when I refused to go in my room anymore because there's a big mean black lady in there. I would sleep on the couch very often after that. My parents looked into the history of the house and found that a little girl that lived there was hit by a car while playing outside. And that a black lady was killed inside. Still living here. Doesn't bother me too much. The weirdest thing I've ever witnessed. With my wife and our roommate. We have a steel security door with screen at our front door. Oftentimes we will open the inside door to let the beautiful weather in. One night we were all hanging out in our living room where the door is with the inside door open. The security door started violently shaking like someone was desperately trying to open it. Not a second or two later and we heard super heavy footsteps run across our roof into our backyard that is covered with gravel. I swear on everything. I heard something human size jumped down and heard the crunching of the rocks but didn't see anything. We have floodlights in our backyard so it was well lit. But there was just nothing there but the sound. I about pissed myself and seriously considered selling the house. But nothing that extreme has happened since. I lived in an apartment that was in a very old building. My girlfriend and I both had several out of the ordinary experiences. But one particular incident takes the cake. It was a loft style place with the second floor partially over the living room kitchen entrance. My girlfriend was doing homework on the couch while I was playing video games next to her. She got up to get something in the kitchen. And came back and could not find her pen. We looked all around in the couch. And she was convinced I was messing with her. She started to walk back to the kitchen to look in there and the pen fell from the second story right on top of her. We stayed at her place that night and I moved shortly after. Used to have regular repeating nightmares where you know someone's in the house. You walk down the hall. Find your family murdered in the kitchen, the old kitchen. Before remodeling. And run for the door with only a faint chance of escape before getting caught. Years after we moved out I learned that my brother'd been having the same exact nightmare. Neither of us had ever talked about it before. I lived in a haunted house for about 6 months with a few roommates. 2 of them moved out before me, leaving just me and one other left. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal. Hence the quick move. I always had a creepy feeling in there. Never really saw anything but it was just emotional and filled with the most dreadful negative energy. And I imagine that's why my other roommates made a swift move as well. One experience gives me the creeps every time I think about it. I was across the country for work at the time and my roommate texted me confused and asked about our kitchen utensils. We had them hanging on mug hooks below the cabinets. She said they were all missing. I was confused as well. She sent me a picture of the empty hooks and I told her to check the living room for the expensive stuff in the case that we had been robbed. She went to check. Came back to the kitchen. And texted me a video, freaking out as all the utensils were back on the hooks. Swinging together in perfect harmony. I stayed at my boyfriend's every night after that. and eventually moved out without ever going back safe to get my things. It shook me to my core. I grew up in a 200-year-old home. First week we moved and we started gutting the house and we pulled this old rotary phone off the wall in the kitchen. A few hours later a phone starts to ring and my mum can't find her phone. Sure enough, the sound was coming from the garbage bag. I wouldn't have believed the story myself, but I saw the phone with the severed wires ringing in my mum's hands. Creepy AF. That was the only thing that's happened in the house that I've personally witnessed. There were a few other creepy things happen that we couldn't reasonably explain. My best friend's sister always heard footsteps in the middle of the night in her very first apartment. It was a fairly old house and she said that sometimes also the cabinets would be open or doors moving by themselves. TV suddenly turning on or off. It also happened with her girlfriend present, but never when her brother or I stayed the night. On a different occasion, friends and I were sitting in a garden pavilion, and as we decided to call it a night and go home, everyone walked to a friend's car, but I stayed behind because I had come by bicycle and was getting it from behind the pavilion. Suddenly, I saw a girl sitting behind the mosquito nets who looked kind of like a friend who hadn't been there this evening. When I did a double take, she was gone. But I still remember her distinctly looking at me. I never raced home faster. I'm pretty agnostic about the whole idea of haunted houses, but my grandparents' house always had a weird vibe. My grandparents bought it new and my grandpa died there when I was baby, so if it is haunted it's probably him. I always had a bedroom there and lived there at various times throughout my life. My mom said when I was about 2 I'd be playing alone in my room and would talk to someone. Then I would come tell my mom and grandma the things grandpa said. A few strange things happened to me when I lived there in my late teens. Like I woke up to the sound of a little kid talking and a baby crying and my stereo would turn on and off on its own. My grandma died about 10 years ago and my brother has lived there ever since. He has a son now, whose bedroom is my old bedroom. When his son was about 2 he asked my brother if he saw the ghost and did it scare him. Double quote. My house is 102 years old. We often hear footsteps upstairs, and our dog will bark at or fixate on seemingly thin air. One time, I woke up with a man just staring at me. My favorite story though is when my brother was on the toilet, and the toilet paper just unraveled. We had a psychic come in who said she felt a lot of energy, and basically described to us the man who used to live in the house and even told us how he died, which is how we knew it was him. She said there is also a girl who committed suicide, fell off a roof that hangs around. Her name is Angela. I know not everyone buys into this, but we definitely do. On a side note that is not house related, my dad's car has sensors on it that go off when something gets too close to the car. Whenever we stop at this particular red light, nowhere else, they go off on one side of the car. A few years back a man died crossing the street there, so we wonder if it's him. We lived in an apartment where my daughter said there was another little girl living. One night, I woke up and was going to go get a glass of water in the bathroom, which was at the other end of the hallway, next to my kid's room. I heard a little girl's voice say, "Mama," from behind me and, thinking it was my daughter, told her to hang on a minute so I could turn the bathroom light on. It was a couple seconds at most. When I flipped on the light switch and turned around, there was no one behind me. My daughter was asleep in her room on the top bunk of a metal bunk bed that squeaked whenever she climbed up or down the ladder. I never heard a squeak. Late to this party, but had a friend whose little brother would always play with an imaginary friend named Rosie. We didn't think much of it. Fast forward 10 years. We learned that Rosie was the name of a little girl who died there 80 years before they lived in that house. Wasn't my house, but my aunt's condo. I used to stay there like 3 days a week. The first thing that happened to me though was I walked my little cousin to the bus stop one morning, and when I got back to the condo, she was at the top of the stairs laughing at me. I was like, how the hell did you get off the bus and make it here so fast? And she bolted into one of the bedrooms. I searched everywhere and she was nowhere to be found. It wasn't her. She was at school. A few other things happened, but the one that really got me was my other cousin, my aunt's daughter, had died in a car accident about 3 years earlier, and one day we are sitting in the living room when an old friend of my deceased cousin comes to the door. My aunt recognizes her as a friend they haven't seen in at least 6 years. She asks for Monica, my deceased cousin, and we break the news to her. She looks puzzled and said, "What?" She was looking out the window as I was pulling up and was waving at me. Double quote. Didn't happen to me but my mom. She was sleeping in a hotel when her grandma, who died when my mom was 6 years old, visited her in a dream. Her grandma said that she has to come with her. My mom decided not to, because she would have left back my dad with 3 little children. We never went back to that hotel. But my mom is convinced that when she dies, her grandma will take her to heaven. That was 20 years ago. Glass ashtray slid across my table in slow motion without making a sound and stayed level for about 18 inches. Then rotated back to front and slowly landed on the ground. No noise whatsoever. The place I live is the original site of the Sacramento City morgue. There's been other things here that have been debatable, but not this one. I had to clean up the mess and I had a witness. I also lived for a few months in a certifiably haunted location. As part of my job I was based on the former grounds of Agnew Mental Facility, now Oracle Corporation, HQ, in Santa Clara, CA. The 1906 earthquake killed almost 100 people, and they buried most of the bodies in the East Wing. I have seen refrigerators burst open, pause, then eject all the food. The ghost of a young girl chasing a co-worker after hours. The cemetery was only tended by women. Men walking by were pelted with gravel and dirt. The women said that if you set down a tool it would float. This is also where Green Day shot the video for Basket Case. I used to play a game with a ghost as a child in my room. I'd place a toy somewhere and run out of the room, then come back and the toy would be somewhere else. In this same home, I experienced very strange auditory paralysis kind of thing in the kitchen by the back door. Found out years later the house had a murder-suicide of a family. I was in a band and our drummer lived with his cool dad who would let us stay over and jam play video games. The first night we stayed at his house he told us if we hear banging in the bathroom or the shower curtain moving not to acknowledge it and go back to sleep. Randomly in the night we'd hear noises coming from the bathroom. I remember waking up to the noises and checking to see if everyone was in the room. They were, and as I turned over on my side the drummer looked at me and put his finger over his mouth signaling me to be quiet. I lay down and we both looked at each other in fear as we heard footsteps leaving his room and going back to the bathroom. We live in an almost 200-year-old Victorian house, passed down through 3 generations. There's been 4 deaths in the house, which has definitely led to some strange things happening. When I was young, 5 or 6, I saw an old woman with her hair in a bun in my doorway. She wasn't moving and strangely was staring down at the ground. She was wearing a long dress, something that would be worn in the early 1900s. This happened in my old bedroom, which is now a guest room. My dad has woken up to see a ghost dog, border collie, that then faded away after he saw it. Our current dog will not stay in that room. He'll walk in, look uneasy, and walk back out into the hallway. I've also had toilet paper violent unroll and fold over itself as I was using the bathroom. I've always tried to find a scientific explanation to that one, but never could. I've also smelled cigars in my house after my grandfather's death, big smoker. And my dad has heard hello in our basement to find nobody down there. Nothing seems to be malicious or dangerous to us, but definitely creepy. Grew up in a house that was over an underground wash, an arroyo and inshore makes no sense to anyone living outside of the Southwest. Lived there 20 years. Only scary incident. Started having sleep paralysis, visual, auditory and tactile hallucinations while paralyzed. Dreamed about a boy named Soggy who lived in a lake. Someone had split his mouth open. He wanted to show me where he lived. Woke up at 3 AM. Left house. Did not return until well after sunrise. Only time I felt something malevolent was in there with me. Mostly the cats would chase shadows. Occasionally we hear footsteps in the ceiling above us at my mom's house. Problem is our house only has one floor. The area above is an attic. If it sounded small I would write it off as an animal up there or something. But these were from something bigger than a raccoon. Like a grown-ass man wearing boots. Then once I was talking to my sister while she was doing laundry in the basement. Eventually I went upstairs. About 10 to 15 minutes later she comes up and is visibly shocked. Apparently for that last 10 minutes she cold swore she was still talking to me. Apparently I was even answering her and continuing the conversation. I know she's not crazy or sick, so she wasn't hallucinating, and there's no way she's that oblivious. I lived in Red Bluff, near the old Adobe settlement. All of the homes on my block, Pony Lane, were built on Indian burial grounds. The stove would turn on constantly. Several times it caught pizzas we had on fire. The doorknobs would turn and the doors would fly open. Hard. We would be watching TV and the cord would fly out of the outlet and across the room. Shower would turn all the way to hot. Several times the door would open and I could feel the sheets move and pressure like someone was climbing into bed with me. In my room, I had to have a blanket over my window because it felt like someone was looking in and staring at you. Right into you. With the blanket up you wouldn't feel it. Very hard to explain. Many things happened in that house. They did not want us there. So happy we moved. Not my house. But I installed home security systems and an old 80-year-old lady lived by herself. Her current security was shoving knives into the frames of windows and doors so they couldn't open. She even had them on her hallway doors, and she insisted that I put security sensors on the interior doors of her home. I found it super odd but thought no more of it and did as she requested. As I'm working, I have to keep going through a laundry room that leads into the garage, and every time I went through there, I'd get a super bad strange feeling. As I was finishing up, I was walking past that room and looked inside and swear I saw something. So I turned around to look and the door slammed right in my face. I've never ran out and gotten in my car so quickly. Called a buddy to have him come back and help me finish up, and he said he felt a weird presence. Anyways, we finished up and the next day she calls my manager and wants me to come back and add an extra camera inside her house, and he told her that I refused to come back because I saw a ghost. And her exact words were, "Oh. Did he see the little girl? Dot. Didn't know if I believe in ghosts or anything till this moment." I personally don't think our particular house was haunted, but there was a lot of weird goings on in the area. There was a haunted house down the road from us near which I had unexplained paranormal experiences, but that's another story. This story involved my little sister, who was only maybe 12 at the time. She shared a room with my brother and was up there one day doing something in the room by herself. Turned around to see a giant headless torso of a dog just floating in front of her. So she screamed for my brother, who came running, and they walked the house. Him with a knife from the kitchen just to calm her down. Still no idea what it was to this day.